everybody, long time no see. Welcome to a Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and guy who is very much not afraid to take the last candy from the candy bowl at the office, Blunchley. In today's episode, Localism and Trump's closure, of the Department of Education. Holy shit, guys, I'm sorry I've been gone for so long. Personal stuff delayed me in getting out a new episode, and also doing two paired episodes was, I think, important because it let me present the conservative and liberal case for localism in a mostly even-handed way, but it sure was a really big pain in the butt, too. Producing two episodes within a cramped time frame, not to mention associated YouTube shorts, was too much to take on in one go. I don't ever want to let the feed go quiet for this long again, so I'm not sure I'll repeat the experiment of trying to put out two paired episodes at the same time. Speaking of the conservative and the liberal cases for localism, last time we spent a little while diving into more contemporary political issues. I thought it was worth doing this because this podcast has a tendency to get a little bit ivory tower, thinking way more about abstract political concepts than things that actually matter or that are happening on the ground. And so because of that, I wanted to touch on things that you might actually see in your community and the political events that are all over the headlines, and ground localism in these more down-to-earth considerations, thereby demonstrating why people should support localism and how it could affect things going on in the future in our daily lives. Talking about how localism interacts with things like the modern Supreme Court or defense policy or taxes is, I think, a usefully concrete way of exploring localism, a way that is not available if we spend too much time talking about dead Michigan judges and non-presidential concurrences from obscure state legal opinions. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to continue doing that in the future, but it is good every now and again to think about things that are happening in the world around us instead of that are happening in old, dead, and buried historical facts. So keeping on with this recent theme of putting localism in conversation with contemporary goings-on, at the end of last episode, I said that I thought Donald Trump's recent executive order, at the time I recorded that episode, now it's 2 months old, but whatever, would be a great contemporary event to explore through the lens of localism. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to take a look at Trump's actions regarding the Ed Department from a localist lens, questioning whether or not such closure might actually further localism's purposes, or how it does or does not further the policy goals of both modern conservatives and liberals. I think this is going to be a very fun and very interesting episode, so let's get started. Okay, so before we can figure out whether or not an advocate for localism would support Trump's actions regarding the Ed Department, first we need to answer two questions. First, what does the Department of Education actually do? Second, what did Trump's executive order actually accomplish? Unless we know exactly what this thing is that we're talking about and how Trump's actions might or might not have changed this as of now unknown thing, we're not really going to be able to tell whether or not closure of this department would be something that localism approves of, or whether conservatives or liberals should be pleased with how things have turned out. The Federal Department of Education began operating in 1980 and was created by a law that President Jimmy Carter signed October 17, 1979. It is one of the youngest federal agencies, and since its inception, it has been subject to significant criticism. One of the platforms that President Ronald Reagan ran on when he was elected was that he would close the Department of Education. Of course, he didn't end up doing that, but this just goes to show conservatives have been after the Ed Department's head for a very long time. Why? Because conservative critics looked at the Constitution and didn't see anything in there about giving the federal government authority over education, and so concluded education should be, as it had been for the vast majority of the nation's history, something left solely to management by the states. They saw the creation of a federal department dedicated to addressing matters related to education as an intrusion into this traditional sphere of state power, and worried that the intrusion of the federal government might result in bureaucratic bloat and budgetary expenses. Or at least this is the line that has generally been provided. As we'll see shortly, the story is a little more complicated than this. At least for modern conservatives. But okay, conservatives are at least right that the Department of Education is a federal agency that does stuff related to education, and education is usually handled at the state level. What exactly is this stuff that the Education Department handles? One way to start explaining this is to actually explain what the Education Department does not do. The Education Department does not exercise any direction, supervision, or control over the curriculum that is taught in the nation's various schools. This includes both K through 12 and college education. The Education Department also lacks authority to direct, supervise, or control programs of instruction, administration, personnel of any educational institution, the selection or content of library resources, or what textbooks schools use. In short, the Education Department is not responsible at all for what is or is not taught in classrooms. This may come as a surprise to you. Based off of the way that the Department of Education is often messaged around when it comes to national political parties, you might assume that the Education Department has huge control over what's taught in classrooms. But that's just not the case. And the reason I know that's not the case is because all that stuff I just said about the Department of Education not being able to direct, supervise, or control educational content, that's straight from a federal law. That law, if you want to look it up, is 20 U.S.C. Section 3403B, which in full reads, quote, "No provision of a program administered by the Secretary or by any other officer of the Department shall be construed to authorize the Secretary or any such officer to exercise any discretion, supervision, or control over the curriculum, program of instruction, administration, or personnel of any educational institution, school, or school system, over any accrediting agency or association, or over the selection or content of library resources, textbooks, or other instructional materials by any educational institution or school system, except to the extent authorized by law." Whew. So, the Education Department is actually barred by federal law from reaching into your kid's classroom and saying what should or should not be taught there. Okay, well, wait. If the Department of Education doesn't have anything to do with what students are learning, then what the hell does it do? The answer is a little bit complicated. Basically, the Department of Education's main purpose is just to point federal funding in certain directions that the federal government wants it to go. Before the creation of the Education Department, a bunch of different agencies across the federal government had responsibilities relating to funding education at the local level. Like the Department of Health and Human Services had an Office of Education, and other agencies that were responsible for administering stuff like the Head Start Early Childhood Program and Education Research had education offices. As a result, the federal government at that time was doing all this funding and other stuff regarding giving money to school systems across several different scattered parts of the government. This meant that the same kind of duplicative work was being replicated across multiple federal offices rather than being handled in one centralized location. This problem was compounded by civil rights legislation that passed in the 1960s and 1970s, much of which sought to improve access to education for racial minorities, women, people with disabilities, and people who didn't speak English. The liberal argument for passing the law that would create the modern Education Department was that it would be a lot more efficient and a lot easier to have one agency that administered all these kind of education-related funding and civil rights programs rather than have the same kind of work be replicated multiple times across various limbs of the federal government. Now, Carter also sought to create the Department of Education because he thought it would help him win re-election. As a nationwide teachers union, the National Education Association was lobbying super hard for the creation of this kind of agency. But passing the law that created the Education Department, Carter received the NEA's endorsement, which was the first endorsement the NEA had ever given in a presidential election. That seems pretty shady, if you ask me. What we end up with after all this maneuvering is an agency whose main job is mostly just handing over a bunch of money to the states. Roughly 10% of all educational funding for K-12 education comes from the federal government. These are paid out via programs that do things like give funds to economically disadvantaged students, or provide money to help support special education or students with disabilities. The federal government also spends money on higher education through things like federal student loans, or Pell Grants, or funds for scientific research. As an extension of this ability to send money to the states for use on education, the Department of Education also has the authority to issue, everyone try not to throw up when I say this word, regulations that place conditions on how these funds are spent. Sometimes these regulations are just stuff like, you need to spend these funds on people with this kind of mental disability, or you cannot spend these funds to renovate your school football field, or whatever. But sometimes, and this is super important, these conditions, instead of saying you must spend your money in this way, will instead say something like, you must have these kinds of programs at the state level to get this funding, or you must have these kinds of policies in place for your school districts in order to accept these federal funds. This means that the Ed Department can use its power of the purse to say, you have to do these kinds of things on the state level regarding education, or we're not going to give you money. This makes what looks on its face like a somewhat mundane pass-through, ho-hum, here's your check, power, actually have quite a bit of teeth to it, and provide a pretty significant way that the federal government can lean on K-12 education or higher education to further the policies of whatever administration happens to be in control at the time. So it is true that the Education Department is legally barred from setting curriculum. But if it doesn't like something that you're doing with education at the state or local level, it can threaten to take away a pretty substantial chunk of your funding. Aside from this power of handing out money and withholding it as needed to assert power, the Ed Department's other really big role is to make sure that all schools are obeying the requirements of federal civil rights laws. This means not discriminating against women or minorities, not making educational decisions based on racial identity, not making faculty hiring decisions based on qualities other than competence, etc. You might have heard occasionally of these certain federal laws referred to as titles, like Title VII or Title IX. These refer to different parts of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in 1964. Remember that one of the reasons the Department of Education was created was to have a body that was focused on enforcing the civil rights laws, specifically in the realm of education. So it makes sense that the Department of Education is having to spend a lot of time focusing on these title laws. Common titles that come up in the context of education include Title VII, which prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and Title IX, which prevents discrimination based specifically on sex in education programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. The Department of Education has various levers it can throw in order to punish or dissuade schools that would violate Title IX or Title VII. One of those levers is to refer a case to the Department of Justice to open an investigation into an educational institution that has been allegedly violating the civil rights laws, which could result in expensive litigation and the need to pay significant damages to affected parties. The other lever, which you might call the nuclear option, is to threaten to withhold funding due to violations of civil rights laws. If this sounds familiar, that's because a lot of that is going on right now in the news. We'll talk about that soon. So here again, we see that even though the Department of Education takes actions regarding civil rights, its biggest authority and the biggest stick it wields to deter schools from stepping out of line is the power of federal funding. Violate the law, and you can certainly see your budget taking a significant nosedive. So now we have a better idea of what the Education Department actually does. Basically, it's a federal agency that administers various funding programs that give money to the states for education. It can pass regulations related to that funding that place conditions on how that funding is used, thereby limiting the purposes for which the money can be spent and setting up requirements the schools must meet in order to receive funding. The Department of Education can use these requirements of federal funds in order to try and encourage or dissuade certain educational actions at the state and local level. Separately, the Education Department also upholds various civil rights within the educational context, including things like employment discrimination and not discriminating on the basis of sex when it comes to students. To enforce these civil rights, the Education Department can bring legal cases against educational institutions and force them to pay damages, and can also threaten to withhold the pretty substantial amount of funding that the federal government provides such institutions. But despite the serious power this gives the federal government to poke and prod state and local educational entities, the Ed Department is barred by law from doing things like directly setting curriculum or requiring certain textbooks or mandating that certain people be hired to teach. The Ed Department does not have the authority under federal law to say what can or cannot be taught in classrooms. You got all that? Great. Let's move on to the second thing we have to figure out, which is what, if anything, Trump's executive order did to change or do away with the Education Department. At the outset, we have to address sort of a weird question, which is, can the president simply say this agency does not exist anymore? The answer is a little bit complicated and raises issues of constitutional law that I'm not qualified to address. And also, I'm just not an expert on any of this stuff, to be honest. But here is the best explanation I'm capable of providing. In short, no. The president cannot just say this agency doesn't exist anymore. That's because agencies are created by laws of Congress. Congress passes a law that says we are creating this agency to do XYZ thing. Once that law is passed, only Congress can get rid of it by either amending it or passing a new law that gets rid of the old one. The president can't just wake up one day and say, today I'm going to cancel all the congressionally passed laws, starting by declaring that the Civil Rights Act doesn't exist anymore and increasing all taxes on people who make more than $1 million by 200%. That's just not what the president, the executive, can do in our system of government that deliberately fosters separation of powers. There is no legislative authority that belongs to the president, and you would need to use legislative authority in order to get rid of the congressional laws that created administrative agencies, including the Education Department. So does that mean that the president just can't do anything to get rid of an executive agency? Well, no, that's not right either. It's true that the president can't just wake up one day and say, I'm getting rid of the law that created this executive agency. But those exact same laws usually put the president and the executive more broadly in charge of doing stuff like choosing who runs the agencies. The president gets to appoint people to these agencies, and if the Senate approves that appointment, then it's the president's people who get to run administrative agencies. And the heads of these administrative agencies can then do stuff like fire lots of people, change what kind of case the agency is willing to take or pursue, withdraw or pass regulations, or disclaim agency responsibility over certain duties that the agency had until that point fulfilled. Think of USAID. USAID on paper still exists. The law that created it is still on the books. But because the people that Trump put in place to run USAID fired everyone who works there, stopped administering incentive foreign aid programs, and voluntarily moved a lot of USAID's former responsibility to the State Department, the agency is functionally closed. The president didn't have to say this law doesn't exist, or I'm going to unilaterally ignore Congress's legislative actions. All he had to do was find people to run USAID who were on board with his agenda, and then direct those people to grind the agency's operations to a halt. And sometimes the president can actually exert even more authority, not by hiring someone to be in charge of an agency, but simply refusing to hire anyone at all. This is getting a little more into the weeds than we technically need to when it comes to the Ed Department, but it is relevant, so stick with me. Let's use the NLRB as an example for how the president can make serious changes by refusing to hire agency heads. You might not have heard of the NLRB. It's not one of the big important agencies like DOJ or EPA or the Ed Department. NLRB stands for National Labor Relations Board. It's the agency in charge of managing America's private sector labor laws, stuff like unions and strikes. That's not super important for our purposes. What is important for our purposes is that the NLRB was created by the National Labor Relations Act, and that act gives the president the authority, subject to a vote in the Senate, to appoint the 5 agency heads of the NLRB. Okay, where is this going? Why am I talking about an obscure government agency that handles union stuff? Well, when you very closely read the National Labor Relations Act, it makes it clear that the board shall consist of 5 members, which is what you call the agency heads of the NLRB, that are appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. But nothing in the act mandates that the president put forward a candidate for a board member. He can, if he chooses, simply refuse to put forward any appointee for an open seat. It's not like the Senate can say, hey, Mr. President, you have to give us a name. He can just totally refuse to fill vacancies. So picture the following scenario, which is sort of what actually happened with several executive agencies once Trump got elected. A new president takes office. There's an administrative agency that for one reason or another he doesn't like. Assume this president hates unions and thus hates the NLRB, the agency that protects unionization rights. So the president fires all the NLRB's agency heads. Then he refuses to put forward any more names to replace all the board members he just fired. So that leaves nobody in charge. No agency heads to order and direct agency actions. You can see how this could inherently cause problems. A rudderless agency isn't exactly going to be efficient or diligent or effective in fulfilling its mission. At best, it's chaos. But here's where things can get even worse. Some agencies, including the NLRB, have something called a quorum requirement. That's a fancy phrase for unless you have an agency head in place, you can't conduct most official business. That means no deciding cases, no passing regulations, no doing any of the stuff that your agency is supposed to be doing. So since the president just came through and fired everyone at the NLRB and is refusing to put new agency heads in place, the NLRB doesn't have quorum. And because it doesn't have quorum, it effectively cannot do any of the stuff it normally can do. Like, for example, get big businesses in trouble for firing people for doing silly things like saying, you should pay us more, or stop making us work in these unsafe conditions. Now the businesses who helped elect the president can get rid of unwanted troublemakers, and the federal government can't step in to stop them. Because Trump won't put new people to be at the top of the NLRB. And without putting new people at the top of the NLRB doesn't have quorum, so it officially can't take any actions. The law that created the NLRB is still on the books, but the agency is functionally defunct. So here's the upshot. Yes, it's true that the president can't get rid of the laws that put agencies like the Ed Department into place, but he totally can fire the people who run an agency and then refuse to replace them, effectively hobbling an agency and making it de facto not exist. Sure, the agency still exists on paper. The law hasn't gone anywhere, but the agency can't do anything in practice. It's hibernating within handcuffs. These two tools of hire people to run agencies who follow your every order and fire the people running an agency you don't like and refuse to hire new people are very powerful, and they allow the president to really fuck up agencies if he so chooses. So now that we have an idea of what the president can and can't do in regards to trying to get rid of an agency, let's see what the president has done in what he's characterizing as his attempt to get rid of the Ed Department. First thing he did, and honestly the most impactful, is put Linda McMahon in charge of the Ed Department. Linda is a loyalist to the bone. She is a true believer who has followed the president's marching orders not just willingly, but gladly. And during her confirmation hearing, she clearly expressed her intent to do everything she could from the inside to shave away at the Ed Department. For example, she repeatedly said that she saw the Ed Department and federal education funding as two different things. She suggested that it was possible to get rid of the Ed Department while maintaining all of these spending programs, presumably by, just as was the case before the Ed Department existed, having all these funding programs administered by various different agencies across the entire federal government. She's since gone on to do two things. First, she's gotten rid of about half the Ed Department staff via a combination of deferred resignations, voluntary buyouts, and good old reductions in force, aka RIFs, aka firing people. No way around it. That's a huge step towards eliminating or at least curbing the power of the Ed Department. Getting rid of so many people will slow down general agency business, reduce the total amount of actions the agency can take, and just overall reduce the agency's capacity. Plus, the people who are left behind will not be overtaxed and asked to do twice as much as they were doing before, which could lead to a loss of morale or burnout, which could then lead to even more people heading for the door. Putting aside the question of whether or not any of this is a good idea that will do good things, there's no doubt that McMahon's cuts up effectively further Trump's stated purpose of destroying the Ed Department. But let me be a hater for just a moment. Sure, getting rid of a bunch of people who work at the Ed Department is a serious blow, but it's not like it actually gets rid of the agency as a whole or changes the power it's vested with. It'll still keep chugging on, albeit with a skeleton crew, but it can keep doing all the same stuff, including all the little ways it has to lean on state and local governments to try and get them to further federal policies. So firing all these people made the Ed Department less effective, but it didn't actually limit its authority in any meaningful way. Speaking of that authority being unchanged, the second thing that McMahon has done has actually not reduced the authority of the Ed Department at all. If anything, it's strengthened that authority, pushed it into new areas that no past administration has dared to tread. I'm talking about McMahon's aggressive participation in litigation against institutions of higher education like Harvard across the country. Trump via McMahon has been more aggressive than any president in recent memory when it comes to using the Department of Education as a cudgel against political opponents. She is strongly exercising that power to cut funding, that arguably most effective power of the Ed Department, to punish universities that don't fall in line with or further the administration's priorities. And for all we know, she could soon begin turning that same weapon against other school systems that aren't just universities. The laws she's relying on to do all of this are all these civil rights laws that the Department of Education is in charge of enforcing when it comes to education. And the fact that this is being used as a sharp sword against political opponents means two things. First, McMahon is preserving that authority. Despite all her claims to be dismantling the Ed Department from the inside, she isn't touching this incredibly potent part of the Ed Department's arsenal. She can't. It's just too useful a tool to punish people with. Her boss would get mad if it went away. Second, McMahon is expanding the Ed Department's authority. By utilizing civil rights enforcement in novel ways, McMahon is setting a precedent for what energetic administrations can do with the Department of Education. She may literally be setting a precedent if the question of whether the Ed Department can cut funding on these grounds ends up in court and Trump wins. So the next level precedent could pick up right where the Trump or Vance or Rubio administration leaves off, by doing all the same stuff only to achieve different ends. Imagine threatening to withhold funds and grants to any school that allows conservative speakers to talk about immigration or American history at campus, or that doesn't teach that America is a fundamentally racist country. Different objective, but identical method, and identical use of power. Needless to say that McMahon's actions in this area aren't exactly conducive to the administration's supposed goal of getting rid of the education department. Before we move on from McMahon, I want to talk about something that she hasn't done yet, probably because it would require several acts of Congress. But let's pretend for a moment that McMahon doesn't have to go to Congress to, very specifically, go through with her idea of transferring all of these spending programs that the Ed Department currently administers to other agencies. She hasn't done that at all with any programs yet, at least to my knowledge. But let's assume in the future she does hand some funding programs over to other agencies. Looking locally, and here by locally I mean looking solely at the Department of Education, no doubt that this reduces the power of the Ed Department. It wouldn't be able to hold funding over the heads of state and local education systems as a way of incentivizing compliance with administrative priorities. That is to say, the Ed Department specifically wouldn't have that power. Looking universally, that is, at the federal government as a whole, you know who would still have that power? The federal government. McMahon isn't saying that she's going to get rid of these funding programs, just that she wants to transfer them over to other agencies. Accordingly, all this would accomplish is transferring whatever coercive power the Ed Department currently has into new hands. The tool of withholding funding isn't destroyed, it's just the wielder that changes. So while doing this would technically further Trump's stated goal of squashing the Ed Department, it wouldn't really further the purposes behind that goal, In other words, reducing the ability of the federal government to control education at the state and local level. Okay, so as we've seen, the first half of Trump's supposed efforts to kneecap the Ed Department was hiring a party insider to run the place, and that's had mixed results. McMahon has made the Ed Department less efficient and effective by gutting its workforce, but has also increased its power by waging war against elite colleges. And her goal of having other agencies administer funding programs would have a neutral effect on federal control of local education. Because unless the programs themselves are eliminated, which would be an extremely unpopular move that McMahon has expressed no interest in as far as I'm aware, all that sending them elsewhere would do is transfer some coercive power from the Ed Department to other agencies. So yeah, mixed effectiveness in the stated goal of killing the Ed Department. The remaining big half of Trump's efforts towards the Ed Department thus far is the executive order he issued in March of 2025. Well, I say big. As we'll see, the executive order actually is kind of a nothing burger. Sort of a threshold question. What the heck even is an executive order? You read one and it's like, damn, is this the president passing a law? Isn't that something only Congress is able to do? Basically, executive order is a fancy description for what is, in effect, a memo from management to the federal workforce. The president is saying, hey, all you people who work for me, here is some stuff I would like you to start doing. It isn't really a law. The president couldn't, for example, write an executive order that said, henceforth turning right on red is legal everywhere in America. He's not a legislator. He can't do something like that, though some presidents would, and have, tried to legislate via executive order. But the president is the head of the executive branch. He's the boss man, the commander-in-chief. So he does have the ability to give marching orders to his employees, underlings, and lackeys. That's exactly what an executive order is, a directive for some or all parts of the executive branch to take action. Okay, with that bit of context, let's get into the meat of the order. First is the title, Improving Education Outcomes by Empowering Parents, States, and Communities. Not sure why we couldn't just call it Closing the Department of Education instead of a bunch of political BS. Is Trump already hedging here, admitting that he can't actually close up a congressionally created agency? But let's be generous and assume this is more a bit of political theater that some nerd said would poll 0.2% better with suburban moms or something. After the title comes the order proper. The order has 3 sections. Let's start with Section 3, General Provisions, because it's the easiest to cover for our purposes. This is a boilerplate section with a bunch of legalisms that are saying, nothing in here limits the authority of my favorite agency, the Office of Management and Budget. This order doesn't create any right or benefit by any party against the United States. You can't, go to court and claim, oh, Trump said this in the executive order, so you have to give me money or something. And this order should be implemented in a way that it doesn't break any other federal laws. This section is, really unimportant for our purposes. Then there's the first and largest section, which is entitled Purposes and Policy. I'm sure it's a lot of crap in here, but as the title suggests, this section is just Trump going, here are all my thoughts and feelings about this subject. It doesn't actually contain any orders or instructions. It's just an extended sharing of opinion, basically. So we don't have to care about it that much. Still, there's some interesting stuff in here, so let's take a look. There's 4 main points that Trump calls on. First, he says that the Department of Education is too expensive and only came about due to the admittedly very shady deal that Carter cut with the teachers union. Second, he says that our educational attainment is incredibly, incredibly poor, and that almost 70% of 8th graders are below proficient in reading, which, damn, fair enough. That sucks and shows at least that things can't keep going the way that they are now. We need to do something to change how education is handled in this country. Third, Trump points to the amount of student loan debt the Department of Education is currently handling, $1.6 trillion, and says, totally reasonably in my opinion, that the Ed Department doesn't have the personnel or the capacity to have to manage that many loans, and maybe a different entity should be in charge of that. Now, he doesn't mention that one of the reasons they don't have the capacity is because his underling just fired half the people who work there. And he also doesn't explain who this different entity is. Does he mean another administrative agency or agencies? My tinfoil theory, and to be clear, this is not said in the order, so this is me just being conspiratorial, is that what he wants to do is he wants to take these loans and then sell them for pennies on the dollar for all of his friends who work in finance. So that suddenly student borrowers owe all this money to banks who didn't have to pay a bunch of money in order to get these loans. And now all his campaign donors and friends get to make a bunch of money off of people who were just trying to go to school. But anyway, again, that's me just being tinfoil. The last point Trump makes is that he thinks the Ed Department's functions, quote, can and should be returned to the states. What functions are those exactly? Setting curriculum and what's in textbooks? But the Ed Department doesn't do that. States are already doing that. Administering loans? He literally just made a very good point about how that problem is so big that the federal government can't handle it. Why are state governments, which are generally smaller and less resourced, any better postured to take on that problem? Maybe he means he wants states to enforce federal civil rights laws. But those are federal laws, so the state can't do that. And in any event, Trump wants to keep that enforcement function for himself at the federal level so he can bludgeon Harvard and the like with it. So maybe he means administering grants programs? He wants to end federal funding of education? That's not going to be a very popular position, but maybe that is what he means. Anyway, none of that shit in Section 1 matters all that much because it's sort of just conveying where Trump's head is at and doesn't actually tell anyone to do anything. That's where Section 2 comes in. Section 2 is the really important, actually operative portion of this executive order. What does it say? Well, first says that the Secretary of Education should take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education. But as we talked about already, McMahon is basically already doing that. This is just telling McMahon something to do that she was already told to do, probably day one she was appointed. This isn't doing anything that wasn't already happening. And the next instruction actually actively contradicts the first. Here Trump says, quote, "The Secretary of Education shall ensure that the allocation of any federal Department of Education funds is subject to rigorous compliance with federal law and administration policy, including the requirement that any program or activity receiving federal assistance terminate illegal discrimination obscured under the label diversity, equity, and inclusion, or similar terms, and programs promoting gender ideology." So basically, go threaten to take funding away from any school that is a little too diverse and a little too gay, and be ready to go to court over it if necessary. But you can't exactly threaten and litigate and negotiate without an ed department, can you? In fact, you actually need the federal ed department to be even stronger than it currently is. If this idea of rigorously enforcing these federal requirements against schools is going to work, you need a mighty ed department with lots of authority to withhold funding and work with the DOJ to sue people. So Trump wants to close the ed department, and he's telling his secretary to do this, but he also wants to use it as a weapon and make it even stronger in order to fight political opponents? If you're thinking that's contradictory, and what the fuck happened to getting the federal government out of education? Why are you telling the ed department to start interfering with education all these ways? Then yeah, I agree with you. If Trump was really committed to ending the ed department, then he wouldn't be doing all this aggressive stuff when it comes to universities' funding and higher education in general. If anything, he'd be telling McMahon, in no circumstances are you to cut funding to any state-level programs. And don't bring any cases against state-level programs because we are done interfering with education that's happening on the state level. He'd also be saying, okay, Secretary of Education, please get ready to cancel all federal funding for education. Education is now something that should be handled solely by the states. But neither of these are really what he's doing. So it might be fair to say that Trump doesn't actually want to shut the ed department down. He just wants to look like he's making it impotent by firing some people and making a big show talking about how much it sucks, while in reality keeping his powder dry and using the ed department as a powerful federal agency that can intimidate and force enemy institutions to stop being quite so liberal. In summary, the executive order, A, tells McMahon to do stuff she's already doing, and B, tells McMahon to vigorously prosecute and threaten anyone that's violating civil rights laws or doing DEI, which actually requires maintaining and expanding the ed department's authority. In other words, this executive order doesn't do jack shit. Its instructions to close up the ed department doesn't have any effect on what McMahon's already doing, and its instruction to keep beating up aid recipients who smell a little bit too diverse contradicts the supposed goal to close the department because it requires a robust ed department to wield that authority. So now we know what the ed department does and what Trump did to try and change it. What does localism have to say about all this? Well, localism's main priority is to put as much agency and control in the hands of local government as possible. That means making the local government, and you, the people that the local government answers to, in charge of education to the maximum extent possible, and directly in charge, not via some elected representative in the state or federal government. So localism does appreciate, in theory, the idea that now the federal government isn't going to be able to use its funding revocation power to look over your shoulder when you're trying to manage education in your own community and say, we sure would like you to start doing things differently, or say goodbye to 10% of your funding. But as we've seen, it's not really the case that the federal government was saying what content is in your classrooms locally, or what textbooks your kids need to read, or what books need to be in your school library. The ed department legally cannot do any of that. And as we've also seen, it isn't even really the case that Trump is trying to actually close the ed department. He's arguably just paying lip service to that idea while actually strengthening its role as an enforcer in American society. But let's assume hypothetically that Trump changes his mind. Let's say he gets serious about just trying to kill the agency overall. No more civil rights enforcement actions, no more funding for anyone. For all the reasons we've talked about, maybe the delimiting of the ed department would provide a little bit more local control, but it wouldn't seem to change that much about how curriculum and classrooms work. As a matter of fact, in my opinion, if you're a localist or maybe even a conservative, it might be correct to say that you're kind of ambivalent, a little lukewarm about the ed department actually going away completely. Because the ed department didn't have the ability to set curriculum in the first place. So getting rid of it doesn't actually restore the local control over education that you were seeking to obtain. It's a solution that doesn't match the problem. All it does is place into question whether or not your schools are going to continue getting this pretty significant chunk of money that they were previously getting from the federal government. Like, the whole power of the purse influence thing that the education department currently has is really not great. But the de facto effect of that influence is that sometimes your schools might not get the money that they otherwise could. Closing the ed department and ending all these federal grants programs would make it so that your schools definitely don't get any of the money that they previously could. Some chance of money is better than no chance of money when it comes to supporting your local school. And this loss of the ed department does absolutely nothing to obtain greater local control over the things that are being taught to your children and the educational materials they're being exposed to. So who should be happy about the Department of Education getting slashed or closing in theory? Well, the answer, at least in the short term, is maybe liberals. As long as you have a conservative administration in place, that administration is going to use the various levers of power available to the ed department to try and influence educational institutions to get in line with conservative priorities. Right now, the administration in power is Donald Trump's, and he's taking full advantage of all those levers to lean on educational entities, especially universities that provide college education that aren't towing the conservative party line. When you see all this stuff in the news about Trump threatening to remove Harvard's funding because of anti-Semitic incidents on campus during protests, or threatening the funding of schools in Maine due to allowing trans women to compete in women's sports, both of these are examples of how the ed department's authority can be used to achieve policy goals, albeit examples that are premised on an extremely expansive interpretation of the ed department's powers. By using alleged civil rights violations as a basis to withhold funding, Trump is using that funding as a leverage to make sure that universities obey his conservative priorities. And all of this leverage would evaporate if Trump was serious about actually getting rid of the ed department. If the ed department went away, or its authority to provide funding to the states and enforce civil rights laws was substantially reduced, then he wouldn't be able to lean on these universities or educational systems anymore. These liberal institutions could just tell him to fuck off and keep doing their own thing like they have been for pretty much this entire time. Because of this, we ended up in this ironic situation where the guy who says he wants to get rid of the Department of Education is actually the one who is trying to expand its authority and use it as leverage to accomplish his conservative priorities. That's why I don't think Trump is actually all that serious about totally getting rid of the Department of Education. It is proving an incredibly useful tool to bludgeon his political opponents and keep his name in the headlines over culture war issues. In fact, I think it's likely that he, while claiming to be limiting the scope of what the Department of Education can do, will push it into newfound areas where previous administrations have not claimed the ed department had authority to tread. The end result of all this is that when Trump leaves office, the first president to, on paper, make an apparent attempt to get rid of the ed department will maybe have succeeded in making it stronger than ever before. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, this is a common refrain of many conservative administrations. They go in claiming to hate the administrative state and federal agencies, and then leave having made those agencies stronger because they use them as useful tools to advance their agenda, thereby setting a new scope of power that liberals can then utilize when they assume federal control. And as a result, we're in this kind of political bizarro land, where Trump is accomplishing some conservative social priorities by beating people with the threat of withholding funding. And because of that, it's liberals that might actually benefit from the ed department's authority being restricted, but it's conservatives who are the ones really championing reducing the ed department's power. But in the end, it might actually be liberals who benefit the most from the ed department not going away and from Trump expanding its authority, because when the pendulum swings back to a liberal administration, now they're going to have precedent to use the ed department in ways they didn't previously have the political cover to pursue. It's really a mess where the fault lines are not as cleanly divided as a lot of people around the debate, I think, make it seem like. Meanwhile, localism is just kind of sitting on the sidelines, trying to weigh the loss of federal funding that could happen if the ed department actually closes down against the loss of local agency that could potentially occur when the federal government says you must do X, Y, or Z or we're not going to give you money. I don't have an incredibly universal answer to which way that balance should come out. I think it's really going to vary depending on each person and each community. As for contemporary liberals and conservatives, well, there's things to like and things not to like about the actions that Trump is currently taking in regards to the Ed Department. It doesn't follow along neat political lines. But whatever you like or don't like about Trump's attempt, or at least what he's presenting as an attempt to get rid of the Ed Department, none of those benefits or costs arise at all from some change in how educational content and curriculum is determined in our community schools. Basically, all of the headline-grabbing BS doesn't actually do what localism wants to accomplish, put the power in local government's hands, in the average person's hands, to make decisions about educational content, classroom curriculum, and the material kids use in school. So my ultimate argument is that Trump's actions towards the Ed Department are a solution that doesn't actually match the stated conservative goal, and in this case localist goal, of giving communities and parents more on-the-ground control over what their children are being taught. If that's the case, how could we actually achieve that outcome that localism wants to achieve? What is the way to make it so that decisions about education are devolved to the local level? The way to restore local control over educational content has surprisingly little to do with any action at the federal level. Instead, the best way, in fact, the only way to achieve localist education is to take the power away from the level of government that has wielded it this entire time. I'm talking about the state government, the state legislature, the group of elected career politicians who do actually get to decide what your kids learn in school. State governments exert massive, almost entirely unchecked power over school curriculum and textbooks and what's in libraries and how your school is run. Yes, you do have a local school board. Yes, this allows average people in the current political system to have some say about what stuff is going on in your schools, but to continue a trend that has popped up multiple times when talking about the relationship between state and local governments in America, state legislatures have been extremely aggressive in giving themselves final say on what goes on in schools across an entire state, even when the communities within that state have totally diverse opinions about how schools should work and what things children should be being taught. The same people and political parties who talk out of one side of their mouths about parental control, local agency, and small government inevitably be the ones who work the hardest to keep local governments from having any kind of ability to make their own decisions. Let's take, and I'm just picking on you guys because you're sort of like the big obvious target. I'm not saying Texas is any necessarily worse than other states in the country about this, but let's take Texas as an example. Texas, like about half of all states in America, actually has a state constitutional provision that creates a state-level board of education. Pretty much all the remaining states instead have created state-level boards of education via laws passed by the state legislature. Here's what the relevant section of the state constitution says. Per Article 7, Section 8 of the Texas State Constitution, quote, "The legislature shall provide by law for a state board of education, whose members shall be appointed or elected in such manner and by such authority, and shall serve for such terms as the legislature shall prescribe, not to exceed 6 years. The said board shall perform such duties as may be prescribed by law." In other words, the state legislature has to pass laws creating a state board of education. The state legislature gets to choose whether or not the members of that board are elected or appointed. To Texas's credit, they do have such members be elected, so people at least get some say in the board's composition. And then the state legislature gets to pass laws that say what the Board of Education's powers are and what it can do. So what does the State Board of Education do in Texas and in many other states? Well, lots of things, most of which we don't have time to get into right now. But the most important thing the Texas State Board of Education does is IMRA, Instructional Materials Review and Approval. Basically, the state board gets complete and total say over what books are used in schools, what curriculum is taught, what subjects, you name it. If something is in a textbook, in a public school in Texas, and maybe private schools too, though to be honest, I wasn't actually able to figure that out, there might be different rules for them, then it's only there because it was approved by the Texas State Education Board. They literally have a list of textbooks that are approved and textbooks that are not approved. And if something is in a textbook in a public school in California or New Mexico or Maine or Alaska, then it's also only there because those states' state education boards approved that material. And that means that the material was approved by whoever is currently at the top of the State Board of Education, which means one of two things. Either this is a career politician who won a partisan political election to get that seat, or it's a bureaucrat who was appointed by whichever political party dominates the state legislature. And of course, if something is annoying the state legislature when it comes to education, it can always just pass a law that says, don't teach this anymore. This is not like the feds, where the Department of Ed's authority is specifically limited to prevent it from dictating from afar anything about textbooks or curriculum. In contrast, as long as it doesn't violate the federal First Amendment or whatever, states can do whatever the fuck they want when it comes to educational material. Their power is essentially all-encompassing. And local governments, to the extent they're allowed at all to make decisions about classroom content, are only playing with whatever scraps of power the state government has deigned to hand down from on high. That's right. The thing in your kid's textbook you hate, the one you think is too advanced for some of their age, or is an inaccurate reflection of history, or racist, or unpatriotic, or whatever, it's not, repeat, not the federal government that's put it there. It's your state government. The same state government that may be run by politicians who claim to want to give you the local agency to make educational decisions by yourself, while simultaneously reserving to themselves all the power to decide what your kid is being taught. To kind of sum up that conspiratorial thing that conservatives say exists, that distant body of controlling politicians who wield their power to alter curriculum and textbooks to push a political agenda on your kids, conservatives are right. That body exists. It's just not the federal education department, or at least isn't mostly the ed department. It's state education boards and state legislatures. And this is where I'm just going to straight up throw away any pretense of objectivity and just be a partisan lefty for a bit. Conservatives pay all this fucking lip service to local control and grassroots government and an America by and of the people. If they were serious about being committed to that, and they were serious about wanting to change America into a country basically run at the local level by ordinary people making their own decisions about what makes sense in their own communities, then this podcast probably wouldn't be called the Localism Podcast. It might be called the Conservatism Podcast. But even though this is what mainstream conservatives claim to want, in truth, they don't give a shit about local control. They just want to use federal overreach and ineffectiveness as an excuse to hand power over to state governments. They just want to trade one unresponsive, corrupt, compromised, and politically captured level of government for a different but equally unresponsive, corrupt, compromised, and politically captured level. They just want to switch out the jerseys worn by the career politicians who rule by edict from afar. Make sure those jerseys say state instead of federal. It's about wresting control away from the feds and putting it in the hands of state politicians, not your hands. If you really want to make education something that's handled on the local level, you need to take the authority to make judgments for all communities across an entire state out of the hands of the state education boards and the state legislature. And the way to accomplish that is the localist forms of government that I've talked about across this entire show. The political reforms that would reverse the pyramid of preemption and make local law preemptory over inconsistent state and even federal law, or at least would restore local control over matters that should be placed in the hands of individual communities like education. And to conservatives who may not be pleased with that I'm taking shots at state governments, which generally tend to lean right and are supposedly the champions of on-the-ground grassroots democracy and small government, I have a challenge for you. And this isn't some clickbaity, I'm trying to next level you, I'm so smart, guess how this is going to come out. This is like a genuine thing I would love for you to try and let me know how it goes. Write your conservative state legislative representative. Tell them that you believe curriculum should be determined by parents, should be up to the community, and should not be set out in programs by distant politicians. And that because of this, you demand that your representative and your conservative state legislature relinquish their authority to say what your kids should learn and instead hand it over solely to your local government, to you, to decide for yourself. I can almost guarantee you that all this big talk about local control and not wanting big government to interfere in the daily lives of citizens is suddenly going to be nowhere to be seen. Instead, your conservative state representative is going to suddenly find a bunch of reasons why it's actually crucially important for all these decisions about education to be taken out of your hands and put in the hands of career politicians in the state capitol. Seriously, if I have any conservative listeners left, if I haven't scared you away by being a hater or a lefty or with my general soyness, please do contact your conservative state representative to tell them to devolve educational authority to the local level and let me know what they say. I'd love to hear from you, and if you give me permission, I'll share what happened in your exchange with a state-level politician in a future episode. And of course, if you're a liberal, you're welcome to do this too, although in general, liberals are much, much more opposed to devolving things down to the local level than conservatives are, at least when it comes to stuff like education. Maybe I'll be surprised. Maybe you, the listener, will write your state legislature and they'll be like, that's a great idea. I'm going to introduce a bill in the next session that abolishes the state education board and says from now on, local governments get to decide completely on their own how education works and the state can't interfere with your community's decision. But I am very, very, very confident that that will not be the response you receive, regardless of whether you're writing a Republican or a Democrat. They'll trot out bullshit excuse after bullshit excuse about why you and your families and your neighbors can't be trusted to think or decide for yourselves when it comes to education. and how you should just leave that all to your good friends in the state government. And until we implement the reforms necessary to make America a localist nation, that self-determinative power over education will continue to elude you, no matter how big a chainsaw Trump may take to the federal education department or how much power federal government hands over to state governments. And that's that. Next time, we're going to get away from events on the ground a little bit and take just a few steps back up towards the ivory tower. We're going to do a series of episodes discussing the mechanics of how localist legal reforms could be achieved. I'll raise some methods, explain how they work under the law, and evaluate how hard or how easy they are to achieve. Spoiler alert, they're all really fucking hard. So look forward to the next episode where we'll take a crash course in how to amend state constitutions. If that sounds interesting, be sure to catch the next episode on Spotify or YouTube, and this time you won't have to wait 3 weeks to see it. Also, feel free to drop me a question or comment at localistpod@gmail.com. That's localist with a T, pod@gmail.com. Catch you all then. A huge thank you to Kevin MacLeod for letting me use the 2 songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.